my brother's law school graduation. The first thing I heard wasn't the applause or the proud chatter of families. It was his voice, sharp and smug, echoing across the microphone. Some of us chase law degrees, others just chase coffee refills. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and I felt every eye dart toward me. The sister who had just rushed from her diner shift, still smelling faintly of grease and coffee grounds. My father leaned forward in his seat, his voice carrying just far enough for those around him to hear. One star, one embarrassment. That's how life sorts itself out. I sat frozen, clutching a small velvet box in my lap, the kind you buy at the corner jewelry store, inside a modest fountain pen I'd saved weeks of tips to afford. In that moment, the gift felt ridiculous, almost laughable compared to the golden spotlight shining on Ethan. And before I dive deeper into how this night unraveled my world, let me ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated in front of people you thought would protect you, only to find they were the ones twisting the knife? Tell me in the comments, because I know I can't be the only one. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button, because you're about to hear how the so-called family failure quietly built something that shook the very ground beneath the people who mocked her. Now, back to that night. The auditorium was buzzing with the smell of polished wood, perfume, and victory cigars tucked into suit pockets. I had slipped into the second row, not too close to the front where the photographers swarmed, but not so far back that Ethan could accuse me of not showing support. He spotted me anyway, and that same smirk he'd worn since childhood crept across his face. A smirk I'd seen when he got into his Ivy League undergrad, while I stayed home with a sick mother, when he landed internships while I picked up double shifts. And now, under the hot lights, he decided to turn my life into his punchline. My stomach twisted, but my face stayed calm, trained from years of not giving him the reaction he craved. Around me, proud parents whispered to each other about their children's accomplishments, dabbing at tears, snapping photos. One woman beside me leaned over and whispered, "My son is the first lawyer in our family. I'm so proud I could burst." I forced a polite smile, wondering what it might feel like to hear my own father say something like that about me. Instead, he sat 2 seats away, not even acknowledging me with more than a stiff nod when I'd arrived, as if I were an unwanted guest. His words, "Didn't think you'd make it. Figured you'd be stuck working," still echoed in my head, though he hadn't even bothered to lower his voice when saying them. The stage lights glared, the names were called, and every step Ethan took was accompanied by clapping, cheers, and camera flashes. My own applause for him was steady, even louder than I felt inside, because despite everything, part of me still wanted to believe that family meant more than showmanship. But then, Ethan's smirk turned crueler, his words cut sharper, and Dad's laugh followed like salt in an open wound. That was the moment the thought crossed my mind, the thought I had never allowed to surface before. What if their version of me wasn't the truth at all? What if the joke wasn't on me, but on them? The small box in my lap grew heavier by the second, my hand trembling as I imagined giving it to Ethan after the ceremony. Would he laugh? Would he tell others the waitress sister bought him a pen he'd never use? I pressed the velvet lid shut with shaking fingers, deciding in that instant that he would never see it. Instead, I slipped it back into my purse, forcing a smile, as the graduates threw their caps into the air. The room thundered with celebration, but my chest felt hollow. If humiliation could carve a hole through bone, then mine had done its work that night. And yet, somewhere under the ache, a flicker of something else lit up. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was resolve, the quiet kind, the kind you don't announce but carry like a hidden weapon. That night wasn't just Ethan's victory. It was the spark that set my entire life on fire. I wish I could tell you that the night ended quietly, that I slipped out of the auditorium and drove away unnoticed. But humiliation has a way of following you like a shadow, dragging your worst memories behind you, even when you're desperate to escape. As the graduates poured into the reception hall, champagne glasses clinking, proud families snapping photos beneath gold banners that read, "Future of Justice." I lingered near the refreshment table with a paper cup of flat soda in my hand, pretending to study the program. Ethan worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, laughing too loud, every movement practiced as though he'd been born for the spotlight. Then he spotted me. He raised his voice, just enough for the people nearby to hear. "Claire, glad you could make it. Did the diner finally give you the night off?" A ripple of chuckles spread through the small circle around him. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile. The kind you learn to wear when you've spent years being the punchline in your own family. "I switched shifts," I said evenly, though my palms were slick with sweat. Ethan smirked. "Well, you've always been good at waiting tables. That's a skill, too." The laughter this time was louder, less polite. My father, standing beside him, didn't correct him, didn't defend me. Instead, he leaned toward a nearby couple and said in that too proud tone of his, "One star, one embarrassment. That's just how it goes." He didn't even whisper. His words weren't a slip, they were a declaration. The couple laughed uncomfortably, glancing at me as though I were a spectacle on display. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to vanish into the floor. My hand slipped into my purse, feeling the small velvet box I had hidden there. I imagined giving Ethan the pen, telling him I was proud. But in that moment, the thought made me nauseous. He didn't need a pen. He needed a mirror to see what he had become. And maybe, one day, I told myself, he would. Still, I stayed. I stayed because walking out would have meant surrendering. And I'd surrendered too many times already. I stayed and watched Ethan toast to his future, my father glowing with pride beside him, while I stood alone near the coffee urn, the smell of burnt grounds clinging to me like a cruel reminder of where I'd come from. And yet, here's the thing. Most people don't understand about moments like these. Humiliation doesn't just crush you, it can also ignite something. As Ethan posed for photos, I remembered the times I'd covered our mother's medical bills while Dad praised Ethan's internship offers. I remembered the nights I'd fallen asleep over spreadsheets on my laptop while working double shifts, trying to build something of my own, even if no one knew about it yet. And most of all, I remembered every time Ethan and my father had laughed at me, convinced I would never amount to anything. Their laughter had become my fuel. Later that night, as the party wound down, I slipped out into the parking lot. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain on the horizon. Families hugged, cars honked, camera flashes still flickered in the distance. My Honda Civic sat alone at the edge of the lot, the paint peeling, the back seat full of my daughter's school supplies and half-folded laundry. I climbed inside, resting my forehead against the steering wheel. And for the first time that night, I let the tears come. They weren't just tears of shame, though. They were tears of exhaustion, of frustration, of a deep ache I couldn't name. Because the truth was, I wasn't angry at Ethan for being successful. I was angry that my own sacrifices, working while Mom was sick, raising my daughter alone after my husband walked out, grinding through nights at the diner to keep a roof over our heads, were invisible. To them, I was invisible. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old messages, a few congratulatory texts from coworkers who knew I'd taken the night off. One from my daughter, Emily, who had stayed at a friend's house. "Mom, you'll always be my hero. Love you." My throat tightened. I stared at her words until the letters blurred through my tears. Maybe Ethan could charm a room full of strangers. Maybe Dad could dismiss me with a single cruel sentence. But here, on this cracked phone screen, was the only validation that mattered. Still, I knew something had to change. Sitting in that car, my face swollen from crying, I made a silent promise to myself. I wasn't going to live the rest of my life being the shadow to Ethan's spotlight. I wasn't going to let my daughter grow up believing that worth was measured by applause or diplomas. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. That night, as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance and rain began to spot the windshield, I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel. Every mile felt heavier, but also sharper, like I was being carved into something new. The humiliation from that evening was still raw, still burning, but underneath it, buried deep, was a flicker of resolve that I knew could grow into fire. I didn't realize it then, but fate had already knocked on my door. I just hadn't opened it yet. When I got home that night, after wiping away the last of my tears in the car so my daughter wouldn't see them, I opened the front door to the quiet hum of our old fridge and the faint glow of her nightlight down the hall. She was asleep, curled with her stuffed rabbit, breathing peacefully, her note still fresh in my mind. "Mom, you'll always be my hero." I stood in her doorway, longer than I should have, the weight of the evening pressing down on me like a stone. But her little face kept me steady. I whispered, barely audible, "I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to both of us." And then, instead of collapsing into bed, I turned on the lamp at the kitchen table and pulled out my laptop. The screen's glow lit the room, highlighting the unpaid bills stacked neatly beside me, the diner schedule pinned to the fridge, the empty coffee cup that smelled of my second shift. Most people would have thought I was crazy, but this wasn't the first night I'd stayed up long after working 2 jobs, combing through spreadsheets, online courses, articles about small business financing, management strategies. For the past year, I had been quietly running a tiny consulting gig from this very table, helping struggling mom and pop stores in town rework their books, cut unnecessary costs, find loans they didn't even know they qualified for. It wasn't much. Some months I made nothing. Other months, just a few $100 extra. But it was mine. And in the silence of that night, with Ethan's words still burning in my ears, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this stay small. I was going to make something real out of it. The first weeks after graduation night felt like walking through fire. I worked double shifts at the diner, sometimes dragging myself home past midnight, only to open my laptop until 2 or 3 in the morning. I researched everything: grant writing, financial models, even coding just enough to build a half decent website. I started saying yes to clients I would have been too scared to take before. A bakery owner drowning in debt, a mechanic trying to expand his shop. I made mistakes, plenty of them. I undercharged, I stayed up redoing proposals. I even had one client walk away after deciding a waitress couldn't possibly understand business. That one stung more than I admitted, but I didn't quit. Their doubt felt almost familiar, like an echo of my father's voice. And instead of breaking me, it pushed me harder. And then came Dr. Mason. He wasn't a client. He was a regular at the diner, an older man with thinning gray hair and a habit of ordering the same black coffee every morning. He'd been coming in for years, but that summer, something shifted. One morning, as I refilled his mug, he glanced at the bags under my eyes and said, "You've been burning the candle at both ends, Claire. What's keeping you up at night?" Normally, I would have brushed it off with a joke, but maybe I was too tired. Maybe I was too raw from everything with Ethan. So I told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. That I'd been helping local shops restructure finances. That I wanted to build something more than tips and night shifts. That I was tired of being invisible. He listened quietly, his eyes sharp, more curious than judgmental. When I finished, he smiled, slid a business card across the counter, and said, "I taught economics for 30 years. Spent the last decade consulting for mid-sized firms. Call me. I think you've got more in you than you realize." That card sat in my pocket for 3 days before I worked up the nerve to dial the number. When he picked up, his voice was warm, steady, like someone who'd been expecting me all along. We met later that week at a library downtown. I remember sitting across from him at a wooden table, my hands sweating, my notes scattered, expecting him to tell me I was foolish. Instead, he studied my spreadsheets, my case notes from clients, even the rough draft of the website I'd cobbled together. "Claire," he said finally, "this is better than half the junior consultants I've worked with. You have an instinct for this. What you're missing isn't brains. It's confidence and structure. And that I can help you with." That moment, it was the first time in years someone outside of my daughter had looked at me and seen potential instead of failure. From then on, our evenings became strategy sessions. He showed me how to structure contracts, how to price my work properly, how to present myself not as the waitress who does consulting on the side, but as a professional who happened to wait tables until her business took off. Sometimes we met at the diner after my shift, papers spread out between ketchup bottles and coffee mugs. Other times, I'd bring my daughter along, and he'd patiently explain numbers while she colored beside us. Slowly, my world began to shift. But it wasn't easy. Every dollar I made from consulting went right back into the business. Website hosting, legal fees, marketing flyers. Some nights, I wanted to give up. Crawl back into the comfort of knowing exactly how many tips I'd take home, instead of wondering if I'd land a client. But then I'd remember Ethan's voice echoing across that stage, or my father's careless declaration that I was an embarrassment, and I'd stay up another hour pushing through. Because this wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving something to myself and to the little girl asleep in the next room, dreaming big because she still believed her mom could do anything. What I didn't know then, as I scribbled notes in spiral-bound notebooks and juggled diner orders with business calls, was that I was laying the first bricks of something much bigger than a side hustle. I was building the foundation of a life that would one day eclipse everything Ethan and my father thought they owned. And just like the pen I never gave Ethan, the irony was almost too perfect, because one day he would have to write his own future with tools I had put into his hand without him ever realizing it. For a while, it felt like the pieces were finally falling into place. With Dr. Mason's guidance, my little consulting side business began to grow. Slowly, but steadily, clients started referring me to their friends. I was invited to sit in on small-town Chamber of Commerce meetings, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something real. But if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that progress never comes without a price. The first cracks appeared when I landed a contract with a local printing company, one of the biggest I'd ever taken on. The owner, Mr. Alvarez, believed in me enough to hand me access to their messy financial records and ask me to design a turnaround strategy. I poured myself into the work, staying up nights, reworking projections until my eyes blurred. Just when it seemed like we were making progress, Ethan found out. He had a friend on the company's board, and before I even realized what was happening, he'd poisoned the well. Mr. Alvarez called me one evening, his voice hesitant, apologetic. "Claire, I think we're going to have to pause. Ethan says you don't have the credentials, and maybe we rushed into this. He says you're still working at the diner." My throat went dry, my chest hollow. "And what does that have to do with the work I've already done?" I asked. Silence. Then he muttered something about appearances and hung up. It was like being shoved back into the corner I'd just crawled out of. I sat at the kitchen table that night, the rejected proposal staring at me from the screen, wondering if Ethan was right. Who did I think I was? A waitress trying to play consultant, competing with professionals who had Ivy League degrees and shiny resumes. For the first time since that graduation humiliation, I felt the temptation to just stop, to shrink back into the life they'd boxed me into. The doubt was suffocating. Bills piled up. My daughter came home with a fever that same week, forcing me to miss shifts at the diner. The medical bills weren't huge, but to me, they felt like cliffs I couldn't climb. One night, as I sat by her bed, cooling her forehead with a damp cloth, I whispered, "I don't know if I can do this anymore, baby." Her half-asleep voice mumbled back, "You can, Mom. You always do." And just like that, a child's sleepy faith held me together when my own strength wavered. But the obstacles didn't stop. Word spread quickly in town, whispers that I was a fraud, that I was pretending to be a businesswoman while slinging burgers at night. I knew exactly where those whispers came from. Ethan. He'd always been skilled at controlling narratives, painting himself as the golden child, me as the cautionary tale. Now, he had an audience of investors, lawyers, and business owners who hung on his every word, and he used that power like a knife. More than once, I walked into a meeting only to feel eyes slide over me with thinly veiled skepticism, some even asking outright, "So, are you really just a waitress?" It cut deep, not because it wasn't true, I was still working shifts, but because they said it, like it erased everything else I was building. Dr. Mason noticed the wear in my face, the slump in my shoulders. One night after a particularly brutal week, I confessed to him, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just pretending. He leaned back, folding his hands, studying me with those sharp professor's eyes that always seemed to see straight through excuses. "Claire," he said, his voice firm but kind, "do you know what I see? A woman who has already done what others wouldn't dare. You've built something from nothing. You've kept going when most people would have quit. Do you think Ethan could have done that if he'd been in your shoes?" I shook my head, swallowing tears. No, he couldn't even have lasted a week at the diner. Mason's mouth twitched into a rare smile. Exactly. The ones who mock you the loudest are often the ones who couldn't survive a day in your world. His words stuck with me, but still, the challenges mounted. The diner cut back hours during a slow season, leaving me scrambling to cover rent. I started picking up odd jobs, babysitting, tutoring high school students in math, anything to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, Ethan's career skyrocketed. He joined a prestigious law firm in Chicago, his face plastered on their website, articles praising his sharp mind and bright future. My father bragged about him to anyone who would listen, conveniently forgetting that his daughter was fighting battles no one bothered to see. And then came the night I nearly quit for good. I had just finished a brutal shift, my feet aching, my apron still damp with spilled coffee. When I opened my laptop to find an email from a client, not a thank you, not even feedback, just, "We've decided to move forward with another consultant, thanks." No explanation, no recognition of the hours I had spent. I closed the laptop, pressed my forehead to the table, and sobbed harder than I had in years. I thought about selling it all, the laptop, the website, the files, thought about burying the dream and settling into the life everyone expected of me. And maybe I would have, if not for one simple thing. When I finally pulled myself together enough to glance at my phone, I saw a message waiting from Mason. 3 words, "Don't you dare." It was almost eerie, like he knew exactly where my head was. Beneath those 3 words was another line. "The ones who mocked you tonight will be the ones begging you tomorrow. Trust me." That night, I didn't quit. I opened the laptop again. I wiped my eyes and resent 3 proposals I'd been too afraid to push forward. I started drafting new plans, even as exhaustion blurred the words on the screen. Because deep down, under all the doubt, the fear, and the sabotage, something inside me refused to let Ethan and Dad be right. They could laugh all they wanted, but the day would come when the laughter stuck in their throats. 2 years passed before the moment came. The kind of moment you secretly fantasize about when you're wiping down tables at midnight or sitting in your car with overdue bills spread across the passenger seat. By then, the consulting business I had once run from a wobbly kitchen chair had grown into something real. With Mason's guidance, I'd registered it formally, expanded into new states, and even created a foundation that quietly funneled resources into schools and small businesses. Projects nobody connected to me because I never wanted the spotlight. I'd learned the hard way that sometimes the shadows were safer. But fate has a way of dragging you into the light when you least expect it. It was the annual donor gala for the very law school Ethan had graduated from, the one where he had mocked me without a second thought. This time, he was being honored as one of their rising alumni. His firm had just made him junior partner, and my father had practically floated into town to see his golden boy shine. I almost didn't go. The invitation had been extended to major contributors, and since my foundation was on that list, Mason insisted I attend. "You need to stop hiding behind anonymity," he said, straightening his tie. "This is your work. Let them see it." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew he was right. Still, as I pulled up to the hotel where the gala was held, my old Honda Civic tucked between gleaming black sedans, my chest tightened with a familiar anxiety. Inside, the ballroom glowed with chandeliers, the clink of glasses, the hush of expensive fabrics brushing against polished marble floors. Ethan looked perfectly at home, moving from table to table in a tailored suit. Dad at his side, bragging as though he'd personally crafted Ethan's success with his own hands. I stayed near the back, scanning the program. Keynote, Dean Lawrence. Recognition of donors. Honoring distinguished alumni. My throat tightened. I knew what was coming, though Ethan didn't. And for once, I didn't smirk. I waited. The dean's voice filled the room as he welcomed everyone, thanking the families, the alumni, the supporters. Ethan's name was mentioned early, a wave of applause washing over him as cameras flashed. I clapped too, because I wasn't here to steal his moment. I was here for something bigger. After a few speeches, the dean adjusted the microphone, his voice growing serious. "Over the past 2 years, this institution has undergone a transformation," he said, "from struggling financially to becoming a model of community-driven excellence. That change was made possible by the extraordinary generosity of one benefactor. Tonight, we break tradition by naming the individual behind that foundation." The room buzzed with curiosity, heads turning, whispers rising. Ethan leaned toward Dad, whispering something smug, probably expecting some tech mogul or retired judge to take the spotlight. The dean continued, "The Clare Foundation has contributed over $3 million, funding scholarships, upgrading facilities, and ensuring access for students who would otherwise have been left behind. And tonight, it is my honor to introduce to you the sole founder and benefactor of this foundation, Claire Johnson." Silence, the kind of silence that slams into you like a wave, heavy and unrelenting. Forks froze halfway to mouths, glasses hovered mid-air. Ethan's smirk fell so fast it was almost comical. Dad's jaw tightened, his face pale, as if someone had stripped the oxygen from the room. Slowly, every eye turned toward me, tucked in the shadows near the back of the room. Mason gave me a small nod. My legs felt like they might buckle, but I stood, smoothing down the simple navy dress I'd bought on clearance, and walked forward. Each step sounded louder than the last, heels clicking against the marble as the dean gestured for me to join him at the podium. I didn't give a speech. I didn't need to. The moment was enough. The murmurs rippled, people whispering, "Her? The waitress? That's Ethan's sister, isn't it? She was the one they laughed at." Ethan's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the floor, the sharp crack echoing like punctuation to the scene. My father's face twisted between disbelief, anger, and something he'd never worn toward me before, fear. For once, I didn't look away. I met his eyes, steady and unflinching, until he was the one who broke contact. The dean handed me the plaque, his hand warm on mine. "On behalf of this institution, Thank you, he said, softly. I nodded, words sticking in my throat because this wasn't about speeches or accolades. This was about every night I'd been dismissed, every sneer, every time Ethan had reduced me to nothing more than a waitress in front of strangers. This was about my daughter, asleep at home, who would grow up knowing her mother had fought her way out of the corner they tried to trap her in. As I turned back toward the crowd, the expressions told the whole story. Shock, disbelief, a few claps, hesitant at first, then louder, growing until the room was filled with applause. Not for Ethan, not for my father, for me. I didn't bask in it, but I didn't shrink either. I accepted it quietly, standing taller than I ever had, letting the sound wash over me like proof that silence had never meant weakness. When I sat back down, Ethan didn't move. He stared at me like he was trying to reassemble a puzzle that suddenly had new pieces he couldn't control. My father shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar, avoiding my gaze. Mason leaned in and whispered, "Told you they'd beg tomorrow?" I smiled faintly because I knew he was right. After the event ended, as the crowd filed out, Ethan finally approached me. His voice was low, strained. "Claire, why didn't you tell me?" I studied his face, the panic beneath the polished exterior, the boy who had once delighted in my pain, now trembling at the thought that he no longer held the upper hand. "You never asked," I said simply, turning away before he could say more. Out in the night air, I breathed deeper than I had in years. The sky was clear, stars sharp against the darkness, the cool breeze carrying away the last remnants of fear. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, not because I had forced them to see me, but because the truth had spoken for itself. And in that moment, I knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning to turn. The days after the gala were like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. For years, Ethan had strutted through life untouchable, his arrogance propped up by Dad's pride and everyone else's applause. But when the truth came out, that the embarrassment they mocked was the very woman funding their precious law school, the narrative shifted. The whispers started immediately. Clients at his firm asked pointed questions about how much of Ethan's rise had been cushioned by family money. The partners didn't say it outright, but I knew they saw him differently. No longer the self-made star, but the spoiled son who had sneered at the very sister who paid his way. Within weeks, one of his big cases was reassigned. A month later, his fast-track promotion was quietly delayed. Ethan's face on the firm's website was still polished, still smiling. But behind the curtain, his world was unraveling. He came to me first, not in the grand way you might imagine, but hunched over in the corner booth of the same diner where I'd once served him without acknowledgement. He looked tired, dark circles etched under his eyes, his confidence fraying at the edges. "Claire," he said, voice low, "I need your help. The foundation, my loans, the firm." I cut him off, folding my arms. "Funny, isn't it? You never thought the waitress knew anything, and now you want her advice?" He winced, but didn't argue. I didn't know. I was stupid, okay? But I can't lose this. Tell me what I need to do. For a long moment, I just looked at him, remembering the smirk at graduation, the way he'd turned me into a punchline in front of hundreds of people. Then I said, "You'll pay it back, not just in money, in work, real work." community clinics, pro bono cases, hours where you actually do something for people who can't pay you back. That's the only deal on the table. His jaw tightened, but he nodded, because for once in his life, Ethan had no leverage. Dad was harder. He didn't come to me in humility. He came in anger. He called one evening, his voice sharp, accusing. "How could you embarrass this family like that, making me look like a fool in front of everyone?" I cut him off, my tone calm, measured. "You didn't need my help to look like a fool, Dad. You've been doing that for years." Silence on the line, thick and heavy. Then, softer, he said, "Claire, I didn't know." My chest tightened, because part of me had always longed for him to admit he'd been wrong. But instead of apology, there was only regret for his own tarnished image. "You never cared to know," I replied, and I ended the call before the ache in my throat could spill into tears. The community noticed the shift too. People who had once dismissed me started inviting me to speak at events, to consult for larger organizations, even to mentor young women starting their own businesses. I accepted some, declined others, but no matter what, I carried myself differently now, not because of the recognition, but because I no longer carried the weight of their ridicule. The truth had broken that chain. And yet, I didn't revel in revenge. I didn't need to humiliate Ethan the way he'd humiliated me, or drag Dad through the mud the way he'd dragged my name. Their downfall wasn't my spectacle to enjoy. It was simply the natural consequence of years spent standing on a false pedestal. What mattered to me was the shift in our family dynamic. At gatherings, Dad no longer boomed about his star son. He sat quieter, more measured, sometimes glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Maybe shame, maybe curiosity. Ethan, too, spoke less, no longer dominating conversations. The spotlight that had once belonged to him had dimmed, and whether he realized it or not, I had no interest in taking it for myself. I'd built my own light, but the sweetest consequence wasn't their silence. It was the respect I saw in my daughter's eyes. She watched me juggle the foundation, the business, and yes, still the diner shifts I chose to keep, because they grounded me. One night, as we walked home, she slipped her hand into mine and said, "Mom, you don't look small anymore. You look like the boss." Her words sank deeper than any applause ever could, because they weren't about money or prestige. They were about presence. Of course, Ethan still tried to negotiate, still tried to find loopholes, but every time he called, every time he asked for leniency, I reminded him, this is the price of arrogance. Pay it or lose everything. And slowly, month by month, I watched him bend. He started logging hours at legal aid clinics, filing paperwork for families who couldn't afford lawyers, even arguing small cases pro bono. It wasn't glamorous, and he hated it at first. But I knew it was exactly what he needed, to feel what it meant to serve rather than shine. For Dad, the price was quieter. He lost the easy pride he once boasted. At barbecues, at church, in conversations with neighbors, he could no longer spin his favorite story of one success, one failure. Because now, everyone knew the truth. And for the first time in my life, his narrative didn't define me. I defined myself. It's strange how peace doesn't arrive with fireworks or parades, but in the quiet moments you almost overlook. For me, It came on an ordinary Tuesday morning when I walked into the diner with the smell of fresh coffee in the air, slipped on my apron, and started wiping down tables. Some people asked why I still kept the job when I had a thriving business and a foundation with my name on it. But the truth was, the diner reminded me where I came from, where I'd been when nobody believed in me. It kept me grounded, reminded me that dignity isn't about the title you carry, but the way you carry yourself. That morning, a group of college kids came in, their books spread across the booth, laughter filling the air. I poured their coffees, and one of them looked up at me and said, "You're Claire Johnson, right? My scholarship? It came from your foundation. Thank you." My throat caught, and all I could do was nod and smile. I went back behind the counter, heart swelling, realizing this was the real reward. Not applause, not recognition, but knowing that what I built was shaping someone else's future. At home, life felt different, too. My daughter, who was now old enough to understand more, started asking me questions about the foundation, about the clients I helped, about the night at Ethan's Gala when everything changed. She listened wide-eyed as I explained, and when I finished, she hugged me tight and whispered, "You didn't just prove it to them, Mom. You proved it to me." That was the moment I knew every sleepless night, every tear in the car, every cruel laugh had been worth it. As for Ethan and Dad, their worlds never completely collapsed, but they shifted. Ethan kept his job, but he worked harder, longer, quieter. He still resented me in moments. I could see it in his eyes. But there was something else there too. A reluctant respect, maybe even a hint of gratitude. Dad spoke less these days, his booming pride tempered into something more cautious. At family gatherings, he no longer introduced me as the waitress, but simply as my daughter, Claire. And while it wasn't the apology I had dreamed of as a girl, it was enough. Looking back, I realized something important. Humiliation didn't destroy me. It carved me. Every insult, every dismissal, every time I was made to feel invisible, it all chiseled me into the woman I became. And maybe that's the quiet truth we don't like to admit. Sometimes the very pain that nearly breaks you is the same force that builds you. So now, when people ask me what lesson I've learned, I don't talk about revenge or proving people wrong. I talk about persistence, about the dignity in ordinary work, about the fact that your worth isn't handed to you in diplomas or applause. It's forged in the shadows, in the nights when no one is watching, when you choose to keep going anyway. I used to think my story was about being underestimated. Now, I know it's about becoming unstoppable, even when the people closest to you try to chain you to the ground. And to anyone listening right now who's ever been called a failure or treated like an afterthought in your own family, hear me when I say this. You are not invisible. Sometimes the ones who dismiss you the loudest are the ones who fear what you might become if you ever step into your full power. Don't let their voices define your story. Write your own. So tell me, what part of my journey spoke to you the most? Was it the night at Ethan's graduation when humiliation lit the fire I didn't know I had? Or was it the gala when the truth finally broke through the lies? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Stories about resilience, family, and the hidden strength inside us all. Because in the end, that's what this whole journey taught me. Not that I had to crush Ethan or silence Dad, but that peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from finally seeing yourself clearly and refusing to shrink. And now, at long last, I can say it without hesitation. I'm not the family failure. I never was. I was simply the one they underestimated. And that turned out to be my greatest power.